Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here to introduce this symposium with 4 extraordinary women working on precisely what Tom Nagel just recommended to do, that is looking at affect, and more specifically on how affect can influence our perceptual experiences. So a few years ago, people were complaining that we were studying vision in isolation from other sensory modalities, and they advocated for a more multimodal model looking at interaction between the different senses. But vision does not interact only with other sensory systems. It also interacts with what we might call evaluative systems, sometimes called also appraisal or affect. And then there is a question, and we'll see today fantastic results showing how affect can influence perception. And we might say, okay, in the same way we've talked about multimodal perception, maybe it is time now to talk about affective perception. But what do we mean exactly by that? And I think that, it's not that often that I quote Wittgenstein, but for once in my life, I will do it. And he has this quote: the world of the happy man is a different one from that of the unhappy man. I think he was rather on the unhappy side. I'm actually a very happy woman here at the ASSC. And the question will be, okay, so it has an effect, my happiness has an effect on my perception of all of you today. But what does it mean exactly? At which level? So is it at the computational level because it involves different types of computation when they are influenced by affect? Is it at the representational level because my perception have a different type of perceptual content when it is influenced by affect, possibly an evaluative content? Or is it at the phenomenological level? Is it what it is like that Tom has been describing? The world will feel differently when influenced by affect. So I think that one of the challenges is to try to reply to this question. And there are several ways based on the results that we will see that can be interpreted. So some people might defend a very deflationary account, according to which, okay, you have this nice effect, but they are just attention. You always get this kind of reply. And they will say, well, look, affect influence attention, giving salience to some stimuli in the world, which in turn will boost your personal performance. But at the end of the day, perception itself is not fundamentally different at any level. So the question I would have is like, is it really just about attention? And maybe also we talk about attention salience, but is that really a unified phenomenon? And when we talk about affective attention or affective salience, maybe it might be something specific and different. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is to define what I call a survivalist account, which says, okay, there might be something in this notion of affective perception, but only for some specific values that you can find in the world, those that are fundamental for survival, such as danger. And so, yeah, in these specific cases, then maybe, yes, perception may be affectively charged or at least evaluative. But then the question like, okay, if you say that you could perceive danger, is the danger really a property that can be visually represented? It's a high-level property, and you might wonder whether it can fit actually into perception. And then there is another kind of theory that you might define, and you say, well, actually, you know what? We think when we talk about affectively loaded perception, we think about smell or taste, but maybe actually it's all our sensory experiences that are affectively charged and that they have this affectivity, like we have, for instance, in pain, but that not only in pain on smell or taste, but also vision or audition. And it would be not only for objects that have strong fundamental value, such as threat or food, but for every single object. And some people have been even talking about microvalence, like even a teapot could have a microvalence. But the question then, of course, is like, if you want to say that all perceptual experiences are affectively charged, you want to say whether the affectivity has the same link to the sensory experience as in the case of pain, or whether it might be different. So in order to reply to all these questions, I have this series of 4 women. I'm very pleased to say, I'm sorry that Patrick Vilmier couldn't unfortunately join us, but we have a series of 4 fantastic women. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Marisa Carrasco. I'm not sure I should introduce her. She's a well-known neuroscientist here at NYU and in the world, both for her work in vision and on work on consciousness. So I think we start the sharings. And
I think there's some chairs over there. So I have to take just 1 second here to share this and hope that it works. And okay, there we go. Can you hear me well? Yes. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Frederick, for the invitation to participate in this symposium. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here in the meeting organized by Ned and David. Today, I'm going to tell you about some research that we did investigating whether emotion modulates perception first, and whether it modulates the effects of attention on both performance and appearance. But I just want to start by us thinking that each time that we open our eyes, we're actually confronted with an overwhelming amount of information. And despite this fact, we have the clear impression of understanding what we see. This requires selecting relevant information out of the relevant noise. There are 2 ways in which attention can help us do this. One is overt attention, simply I move my eyes to regions of interest. And the other is covert attention, where I allocate attentional resources without concurrent eye movements, right? So for example, I'm looking at Susan, but I'm kind of monitoring Ned. I can do that, all monkeys can do that, all mammals that have been tested can do that. So in my lab, we investigate visual attention using a variety of complementary methods from psychophysics, neuroimaging, neurostimulation, and computational modeling. Today, I'm actually just going to tell you about some psychophysics, and I have to say that emotion is not my main area of interest, but I became interested some years ago when we were studying the effects of attention on performance and appearance. Before I start, I want us to think why it is that we have limited resources. And this is related to the bioenergetic cost. So about 2 decades ago, our former colleague Peter Lenny published this beautiful paper called The Cost of Cortical Computation. So we know that our capacity to process visual information is limited by the high energy cost of cortical computation. First, there's a constant overall energy consumption that is available to the brain. 20% of the body energy is allocated to our brain, and 44% of the brain energy is allocated to cortex. The neuronal metabolic cost depends on the spike rate, and the cost of a spike is high, and that's why the average discharge rate of active neurons determines how many neurons can be active concurrently. And the calculations that he did, which are biophysical calculations, are staggering. The answer is that it's only 1% of neurons that can be concurrently active above base level. Now, if this is the case, then it follows that the brain needs machinery to allocate energy according to task demand. So we can think of attention as an energy manager mechanism, not the only one, but a very important one. By enhancing the representation of relevant information while diminishing the representation of irrelevant information, attention optimizes our system's limited resources. And today I'm going to talk about covert spatial attention, on which there are 2 kinds. The first one is what we refer to as exogenous spatial attention. It's involuntary, fast and transient. Its effects peak at about 120 milliseconds and decay quickly thereafter. So here I'm just illustrating. Imagine that you're looking at the center of a screen. 2 Gabors are presented simultaneously. One of them is going to be presented by a little cue, and we're going to see what effects are on perception. And that is completely independent of the cue validity. Even if you tell people that the chances of the stimulus that you want to respond to are at the cue location or the uncued location, the results are exactly the same for this invalid, fast, and transient mechanism. which peaks at about 120 milliseconds. And this is the system that I want to talk about today. I just wanted to contrast it very quickly with endogenous attention, which is voluntary. It's deployed slower. It takes about 300 milliseconds to be deployed and can be sustained at will. But today I'm talking about this exogenous involuntary system. Now, many years ago, in the lab, we investigated if attention could enhance contrast, which is the most fundamental visual dimension. So if you look here at this contrast sensitivity function, we're plotting contrast as a function of spatial frequency. And depending on how far you are seated, how good your eyes or your glasses are, there's going to be a moment that you can see contrast below this curve. You can see alternations of light and dark. And above this curve, there's a moment in which you can no longer do that. Now, if you have glasses, just take them off and you see the big difference that it makes. Oh, yeah. And if you don't have glasses, just fixate here and you see also how it changes, because it changes with eccentricity. Now, at that time, it seemed like a little bit of a crazy question, and my neurophysiological friends actually were wondering what I was doing, except that I thought that it would be good to go to the most basic dimension and say, is it possible that attention affects this dimension? And if the answer was no, then we would move to the next higher level and so forth. But to our surprise, actually, and by now there are probably 50 studies from many different labs that show that exogenous attention enhances contrast sensitivity. So it expands the window of visibility. Okay. Now, every single object that we see is decomposed into Fourier components, which are contrast, orientation, spatial frequency, and phase. So this is the most basic level of analysis, but upon which all object recognition is based. Now, these effects take place in early stages of visual processing, and there's several studies from many labs that have shown that early visual cortex is implicated. fMRI provides neural correlates, right? Now, if we really want to know if there's an area that plays a causal role, then we have to use, with humans, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. When we stimulate a cortical region, the stimulation briefly disrupts the balance of excitation and inhibition, and therefore TMS is an ideal tool for inferring the causal role of a brain region for a specific task. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because now we know that the most early visual cortex, V1 and V2, actually play a causal role in this exogenous or involuntary attention that I mentioned, but not in endogenous attention. Now, today, as I said, I'm going to talk about the effects of emotion, and there's two questions that we want to ask. The first one, this is in collaboration with our former doctoral student, Sam Link, who's a professor in BU now, and we ask, does emotion modulate perception? And if the answer was yes, then we would address the second question, which we did is does emotion modulate the effect of attention on performance? And then I'll tell you about the third question that we addressed many years later. So let's imagine that you are participating in a study and you are sitting in front of the computer. We ask you to fixate, and we are going to monitor your eyes all the time to make sure that you're fixating. A cue is going to briefly appear, and after a brief interval, interstimulus interval, the stimuli are going to appear. There's 4 stimuli. One of them is going to be tilted, and that's going to be the target. You have to respond whether it's tilted to the right or to the left, very basic. And 3 other are distractors. And in this case, which is to my knowledge the first time that it was tested whether actually emotion, in this case a fearful phase or a neutral phase, could affect differently contrast sensitivity, we simply presented a cue briefly here during this time in the center of the display. And what we found is very basic. Here we show performance on the y-axis as a function of stimulus contrast. In black, you see the typical sigmoidal function. And this is what we obtain with a neutral phase, which you see on the bottom here. This is part of the Ekman set that many of you may be familiar with. But what we found is when the phase had a fearful expression, then the contrast and the response function was enhanced. Okay? Now, obviously, it's very important to rule out low-level factors. For example, if I go like this, because I'm fearful, I'm opening my mouth and my eyes may get more wrinkles and so forth, right? So we want to rule out any low-level factors. So we simply put the faces upside down, and there's good evidence that we cannot recognize emotion, but the quality of the stimuli is exactly the same. And what you see is that now the two functions are absolutely indistinguishable, okay? So once we established that emotional valence of the face improves contrast sensitivity, we investigated attention. So the trial sequence is going to be the same, but now we're going to have 4 cues. They're going to be either a fearful or a neutral face that appear at one particular location where the stimulus is the target is going to appear, or 4 distributed fearful or neutral faces, which would give us the baseline, okay? And I will skip many figures. If you're interested, you can find them in the paper. But I really like to show the effect with these stimulus contrasts that are based on the results. So as you can see here, the grading shown represent the contrast health threshold in each condition. That is, what's the contrast necessary to perform the orientation discrimination task at a level of accuracy of 80%. So the lower the contrast, the higher the contrast sensitivity. And you can see clearly that there's an effect of emotion, whereby the fearful peripheral cue needed less contrast than the neutral peripheral. And likewise, the fearful distributed needed less contrast than the neutral distributed. So this is a basic emotion effect. Now, when we evaluate attention, now we're going to compare the neutral peripheral versus the neutral distributed. And as you can see, again, we need less contrast for the peripheral than for the distributed cue. And when now the cues are emotional, they're fearful, we see that the difference is more pronounced. So if we put together these effects, we see that emotion potentiates attention. Okay? Now that we established this, we had another question, which was to do with the effect of attention on appearance. Many of you may know that, well, I know philosophers like that question, net. And here we ask whether emotion modulates the effect of attention on appearance. And Antoine Barbeau, a former doctoral student in my lab, and I did these studies. Before, let me just remind you a little bit of emotion. So the emotional valence of attentional cues potentiates the effects of attention on early vision, like the study that I just showed you, and there's been many consistent findings from many labs. So that's well established. The second point is that emotion and attention interact at early stages of visual processing. And Judith is going to tell you about the role of the amygdala and probably some visual processing. And we know that anxiety increases the effects of attention on performance. So let me just show you exactly the experiment that we did, and then I'll tell you the results. So if you fixate on the screen, I'm going to just run you through a trial. So you are fixating, we're monitoring your eyes, 2 stimuli appear simultaneously, and we simply ask you to say the orientation of the stimulus of higher contrast. Now, unbeknown to the study, to the participants, one stimulus is a standard and another is a test that takes many values. They appear at chance, of course, and they have different spatial frequencies. And the first thing that we're going to do is plot the number of times that people report the perceived contrast of the test higher than the standard as a function of the contrast of the test stimulus. And then we calculate the point of subjective equality. That is, what is the level at which people respond 50% that the test is higher than the standard? And what we see is that the point of subjective equality actually corresponds to the standard contrast. That is a replication of many, many studies. Now, the attention manipulation is the following. If you look at the fixation again, a cue is going to briefly appear among one of the 2 stimuli. And again, I would ask you to report the orientation of the stimulus of higher contrast. Ready? Look there, not on me, there, okay? Okay. All right, that's it, very simple. What we found many years ago is that if we plot the perceived contrast, the number of times that people respond that the test is higher than the standard, as a function of the contrast of the test stimulus, in black, you see the neutral cue, which is simply going to give us the typical sigmoidal function. The interesting thing here is that if we pre-cue the test, now we need less contrast in order to attain the point of subjective equality. And correspondingly, if now the cue precedes the standard stimulus, now we would need more contrast. At the bottom, you see again the contrast that people needed. So if you were fixating here and there's a cue on the left, these two appear the same. And likewise, if the cue was on the left now, these two would appear the same. Now, obviously, again, we have to rule out all kinds of alternative interpretations. And a very simple one among 12 that we have done is one in which we simply lengthen the delay between the cue and the stimuli. And as you can see, now going from 120 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds completely eliminates the effect. Okay? Now that we have this basic effect of attention on appearance, we wanted to see what's the role of emotion. So the protocol is going to be the same. And we're going to have, again, cued or distributed cues. And this is upright faces with a neutral expression or a fearful expression. And we're going to invert them too as a control. Now, in this case, because the stimulus on the left is of higher contrast and tilted to the right, you would press with one key press, with one button, you indicate both the orientation and the contrast, the perceived contrast. Okay? And what we found, and in addition, in this study, we obtained trait anxiety for each observer. They are completely within the normal distribution, so nobody is an anxious pathological person. But we did this because besides the influence of external emotional stimuli on perception, exogenous attention, internal states such as arousal and anxiety can shape ongoing neural activity and interact with the attentional selection of sensory inputs. So anxiety is associated with augmented amygdala activity, and we reduce prefrontal attentional control. And this could explain why high trait anxiety participants exhibit stronger attentional effects on performance in response to emotional cues, as had been shown previous to this study in many, many tasks. Okay? So the first thing that we plot is performance, and this is for the uncued, the neutral, and the cued stimulus. And this is under the optimal interstimulus interval, when we expect attention to have an effect. Now, in the middle, we plot the attentional change in performance. And what you can see is that the effect of the fearful phase is greater than that of the neutral phase for upright faces, but not for inverted faces. And furthermore, the effect of attention on performance for the upright faces increases for people with high trait anxiety. And this is mainly due to the fact that there's a pronounced cause for people with more anxiety. And it's been shown that it's difficult for them to disengage when the cue appeared before the lower contrast stimulus. Okay? Lastly, the interaction of emotion and orientation performance increases for people with higher trait. Nope, I have 15. Okay. That's why I time myself. I'm a New Yorker. Okay. So, so we do the control, and I'll go faster here, but just to show you that with a longer interstimulus interval, there's no significant effects on appearance, and there's no relation with trait anxiety. Now, appearance, the most interesting result for us. This is when we show, again, the function that I had shown you, but here I want to compare the effect of the fearful phase over the neutral phase, and again show you that this is significant for the upright faces, but not for the inverted faces. And in this case, we find that the effect of attention appearance is more pronounced for people with high trait anxiety, and this is due to the effects of both the standard stimulus as well as the test stimulus. So if we plotted this sigmoidal function for each person, the people with higher anxiety would have those curves farther apart. And moreover, the interaction of emotion and orientation and appearance increase for people with high trait anxiety. So what we show here is that both effects of attention and emotional potentiation of attention are mediated by the observer trait anxiety level. The high anxiety individuals exhibit a heightened amygdala response to potential threat, And anxiety is also being associated, as I say, with a reduction of prefrontal regions. Now, just to show you the control experiment, if we have now the not optimal interstimulus interval, all the effects go away. And last, I want to show you that there's an effect of performance and appearance that correlate for the optimal ISI, but not for the not optimal one. So to conclude, I have shown you that emotion enhances contrast sensitivity, independent of attention. This is direct perception, the most basic aspect of perception. Second, I show you that emotion potentiates the effect of attention on performance, as well as on appearance. And anxiety modulates the effects of emotion and attention, both on performance and on appearance. So altogether, this shows that emotion and anxiety potentiate the effects of attention on performance and appearance, and emotion and anxiety can truly alter how we see. Now, just to respond to the levels of analysis that Frederick started with, those perception involves different types of computations when influenced by affect. The studies that I have shown you have nothing to say about it. I know how I would go about it now, but I cannot provide a response. Representational level, does perception have a different type of perceptual content when influenced by affect? Yes. And lastly, at the phenomenological level, does the world look different when influenced by affect? Yes. I just want to thank my lab. As always, there's some people here actually that are former members of the lab, that are now professors and grad students and so forth. And in particular, I want to thank Antoine Barbeau and Sam Ling, who were doctoral students in my lab when we conducted these studies. Thank you so much. So we have time a little bit for questions. Don't forget to plug your mic when you speak in front of you. Yes, at the back, yes.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much. I was curious about the pupil size because you had like eye tracking.
Yes.
Does the fearful faces modify pupil size and can also account for part of your results about contrast?
No, they cannot account for the results about contrast, because if you see higher contrast, your pupil size actually would be diminished. Right? So they cannot account for it. In this study, we have not looked at pupil. In other studies, we have looked at pupil. Now, the pupillary response that you're talking about is sort of arousal, overall arousal. What I'm showing you here are selective effects of attention, which are different for the different stimuli. So it's also that you need, it's technical, and I can go over there, but you need longer time to have a good base level for the pupillary response than what we had in this study. But in other studies that we've shown, we can see that there's dilation, but this is not the effect of selective attention. Okay.
Thanks, Marissa. That was a really great talk. So as I recall from one of the 3 times I attended your course on attention, you have and others have found the mechanisms of these attentional effects in early visual processing, and they include things like expansion of receptive fields. But what could the mechanism of this be? It can't be that all receptive fields are expanded. So what is it?
Yeah, no, so most likely, and Judy is going to talk to you about the amygdala, but we know that there are projections from the amygdala to visual cortex, and we know that they're very, very fast. And that's why it's possible that within the timing of exogenous attention, we can see that effect of emotion. So the idea is that there's some information that gets to the amygdala, so cortical is very, very fast, and the amygdala projects back to early visual cortex. Susan?
So how do I turn this on? So you just did fear faces. So how general is the emotion? Would you see the same effect for anger? And what about happy faces?
We have with Petra Better, who is there actually some studies in which we show that there's differential response for different emotions. In this case, we don't have different valence. But Bocanegra has studies that are very similar to ours, in which he has shown actually that it is also the case for positive stimuli.
Do you have to be aware of the facial stimuli, or does it work if the emotional faces are masked?
That's a very good question. So in this case, we made sure that people could see the emotion, but it was a different group of observers. We just made sure that at the eccentricity that we were presenting and for the time that we were presenting, people could distinguish the emotions. And then we tested another group of subjects. Now they're very briefly flashed, but what I remember is that I could see the emotion. Some people have shown that for exogenous attention, actually, you have effects in which the cue can be subthreshold and you still get an effect. Now, to my knowledge, that has not been done with emotion, but it's to my knowledge. I'm not that sure. Okay.
So last question, why Judith set up? Yes.
Thank you. Do you have any data on valence effect separated from arousal?
Yes, so not in this study, but I just want to show you that here, if you have a selective response of attention, it cannot be just arousal, because arousal is an overall response. So if I show that this is perceived as having 8% contrast more, and this like having 6 less, it cannot be arousal, right? We are within 10 degrees of visual angle. There's a selective response. Attention is all about selective responses.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Marisa.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Can we just say there are some chairs there?
Yeah,
People get stuck here.
And there's an extra room if you want. So it's a pleasure to introduce Judith Dominguez for us, and Patrick Grenier, we unfortunately cannot join us. I should say that Judith had been working on this question for many years now, and just got a fantastic European research council report on the topic that is starting in September. So without further ado,
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Frederic, for inviting me. And I'm actually speaking on behalf of Patrick and a little bit myself too. So, and I'm going to talk about something. I will give a general overview on all these effects of emotion, on perception and perhaps attention, based on more or less a little bit of amygdala and the neural circuits that involve the amygdala. But of course, in 20 minutes, it's difficult, so it will be very general and not too many details. So, as Marisa explained very well, survival, well, she did not mention survival yet, but it depends on efficient detection and adaptive response to emotionally relevant stimuli. So stimuli that are have some emotional content. We need to be able to detect quickly and efficiently, and then orchestrate a number of adaptive responses to these emotional stimuli in order to, of course, survive at the end of the day. And there is a lot of evidence, not only with all the very influential works that Marisa did in the past, but we know that, in general, affectively salient stimuli are, in general, more readily detected than neutral stimuli. So this is just one of many tasks with a visual search task where you are supposed to detect a target. And if this target is emotional, actually, you are faster at responding to the emotional stimulus in respect to the non-emotional stimulus. And this effect usually is linked somehow to the perception or the how you appraise the stimulus as being feared for you and based on your experiences. So this, for example, in this specific study, spider fearful subjects are faster. So this effect of faster detection is more pronounced for spider stimuli, and snake fearful subjects have this effect more pronounced for snake stimuli in general. And of course, depending on task conditions, the behavioral effects can actually be different. So it's not always correlated with the faster response. It could depend on many other factors, but this is just one example. In general, the response is modified by the emotional stimulus. So one question that has been asked for many years is whether this effect is actually correlated with an enhancement of the sensory response in sensory regions. And there is a lot of evidence, this is just one example of, we know that there is a selective increased response to emotional stimuli in sensory cortices, but it is important to point out that it is selective, so it's not a generalized arousal increase of the cortical response. For example, for emotional faces versus neutral faces, you have an increased response in the face areas, or for emotional versus neutral bodies, you have an increased response in body areas, also in temporal lobe, and the same for emotional voices, emotional versus neutral voices. We have seen also that this increased response by emotion occurs in primary sensory cortices, and this can occur also across modalities. For example, if we present an emotional phase together with a tone, just a stimulus, that an auditory stimulus, or if we present the emotional phase with touching the cheek, just a somatosensory stimulation, you have an increase, a corresponding increase in many selective sensory regions, but specifically in primary, for example, in primary auditory cortex or in primary somatosensory cortex. So it's quite early. And also there is a lot of evidence from EEG showing that this effect, this increased response in the sensory response is actually very early, or quite early, around 100 milliseconds or sometimes even before. And this occurs for vision and for instance, audition. This is just one recent study that we are conducting. The question is something completely different, but we can see that in some conditions, in this case, it was high amplitude modulated sounds. I will not go into this, but the increased response, the auditory response, can occur very early. So, of course, if we talk about this increased sensory response in the cortices, we have to talk about the amygdala. Well, the amygdala, as probably all of you know, is a structure located in the medial temporal lobe, and it has been said that it is very well placed. It is at the geometric center of the brain, because of that, and because of the so good connection that it has, so it received lots of connection, lots of inputs from many cortical and subcortical regions, and it also sends projections to many cortical and subcortical regions. So it is very well placed to receive the sensory input and then send this increased adaptive modified response to the emotional stimulus. We have seen, for example, that these increases in sensory cortices are suppressed or decreased with lesion in the amygdala. For example, this is a classic example among many where patients with medial temporal lobe sclerosis having an amygdala lesion, and only in the amygdala, actually show an impairment or a suppression of this increase in response in the visual cortex. And this is correlated with the degree of amygdala damage ipsilateral to the sensory, or the fusiform in this case. So there seems to be some causal relationship between amygdala and this increased sensory response. We have recently also seen that amygdala lesion may also impair emotion detection, so the detection of these emotional stimuli. This is also very debated, I have to say, but this is one patient that we recently tested, presenting, she had a herpetic encephalitis, and well, she presented a very extensive bilateral lesion in the amygdala, and then we tested her with many different tests, and one of them was, for example, a simple visual search task. Usually in these tasks, people are more effective, or they detect more effectively emotional or color faces, this bottom-up pop-up.
We just need to share screen through Zoom.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Which one is it?
I think it's that one. Yes.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So they missed half of that.
I can kind of see it behind you. Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry. So, well, this is set. So typically in these tasks, people are more effective at detecting targets that are emotional or even more colored as compared to non-emotional stimuli that differ, targets that differ in just identity, for example. And what we observed was that, for example, in this specific patient, this patient had an impairment in this benefit of emotion on detection for specifically fearful and happy faces. And the effect, in fact, was more pronounced for happy faces. And the interesting thing was that this patient did not present, or she was even performing better than normal controls for colored faces. So her bottom-up exogenous attention for color was intact. However, the emotion detection was affected. But there's a lot of other data. So the idea is that the amygdala, specifically the basolateral amygdala, it is so well placed that it receives inputs from a number of brain regions, but specifically now we're focused on the sensory systems. It receives inputs from the sensory systems, and these inputs can be sometimes very direct. It is at the cortical level, or also specifically at the subcortical level. And some of them can be actually very fast, as Marisa mentioned. There is even a recent study showing direct inputs from the retina to the amygdala under some conditions that are activated under some conditions. I think it was in mice. So, and this has been proven in many, many sensory systems, especially vision and audition. So the amygdala is a privileged structure for the integration of sensory information and stimulus value representations. In turn, the amygdala, okay, it receives the inputs and then it says somehow, okay, this is effectively significant, and then it sends some outputs to a number of regions that, to modulate perception and potentially awareness via many potential pathways. But it could be either directly to the sensory systems. There is a lot of data showing direct connections, projections from the amygdala to visual, auditory, somatosensory, olfactory, even gustatory, primary, and association cortices. Or it could be indirectly through the attention systems. And the attention systems is a very wide, broad concept, but in this case, with the frontoparietal. Or it could be other indirect modulations through the cholinergic systems, the noradrenergic systems, so on. But it seems to have a specific role. So to one of your questions, Frederick, what is affective salience? Because we are very often working with emotional faces, so stimuli that we know elicit some kind of affective reaction. But what is affective salience? So I thought maybe a nice thing would be to ask the amygdala what is actually salient. And then if you go into the literature and try to wrap up or put together evidence that we have from fMRI, single unit recordings in human primates, human and non-human primates, mice, so we can say, I'm going to say a long list. So one is social cues in general. So the amygdala likes faces, voices, and some face features, for example, eyes. Is very responsive to eyes, especially if they are very wide open. Of course, it responds even more to emotional facial expressions, and that's why we use it so much in the lab to study emotion processing. It detects, it responds to predators. For example, in monkeys, it has been said that seen that some neurons respond specifically, like very much snakes, and also in humans. Also complex emotional sceneries, or sceneries that are depicting an emotional situation such as mutilation or some violent scene. Also emotional voices, so voices with emotional prosody. Also music in general, it is usually responding with affective content of the music, but this is more complex because music is a complex stimulus. And then pleasant or unpleasant odors or even tastes. And more generally, it responds to arousal. For example, there are some neurons that have been described in the amygdala that are specific for arousal, intensity of the stimulus, regardless of valence, for example, if it's positive or negative, but also positive and negative valence. or some physical patterns or shapes or something that might be. So the idea is that the amygdala might be also pre-wired to respond to certain stimuli that might, certain characteristics of the stimuli that might indicate a threat. But this would be coming from many, many, many years ago in evolution. So such as sharp objects or roughness in sounds. And obviously, emotional stimuli that have acquired an emotional meaning after conditioning, for example, associative learning, no? Or Pavlovian conditioning, and yeah, and or novelty or ambiguity, uncertainty, or even the perceived judgment of emotion by the subject. So it sometimes in some study it has been shown that it is not, the response is not related to the valence that we attribute, but to the perceived judgment by the subject. And more generally to relevance and the relevance that this stimulus has for yourself. For instance, if you associate it to a reward, the amygdala will respond more, or if it's relevant for the task. For example, we have recently seen that this would be amygdala response to meaningless shapes, squares or circles, but that are in fact targets, no emotion, nothing whatsoever, but the amygdala still responds more. So we could say that the amygdala may detect value or significance based on one's own experience, learning, for example, as it is understood globally, or the goals or innate biases by the individual. So it is extremely subjective, and it is very difficult to put into boxes what is affectively salient and what is not. But having said that, okay, another big debate is whether the amygdala can respond to affective salient stimuli unconsciously. And I am really afraid of saying that word in this meeting because I know. But anyway, so we have recently tested it with a continuous flash suppression paradigm, where, as you may know, a stimulus presented to one eye is rendered invisible by dynamic noise presented to the other eye. And we have seen, this is a preliminary and ongoing work, but that the amygdala can actually respond to, in this case, it was fearful faces versus neutral, slightly earlier, but it does respond slightly earlier than when the stimulus is conscious. So the whole idea would be that emotion signals that would be detected by the amygdala may work in parallel and with mutual influence with attention. For example, there is the classic example that detection of affective salience may still be present in patients that present inattention, some sort of inattention. For example, patients with spatial neglect. Patrick Villemier has studied spatial neglect patients for a long time, but basically these patients have a lesion, usually in the right parietal cortex, but it's very, of course, it's not homogeneous. And usually these patients ignore or are not aware of their left half, usually, of the world. So, and this can be in vision, in addition, with somatosensory stimulation. It's quite multimodal. And the important thing is that these patients have intact sensory systems, so they can actually, even if not attending, their sensory systems can perceive information that could potentially be salient, emotionally salient. And it has been repeatedly shown that these patients, in fact, present fewer misses on the left side, the ignored side, when stimuli are, in fact, emotional compared to neutral. For example, in that case, this would be the left stimuli missed when spiders are presented on the left visual hemifield. We have some other data. This is another example that applies. It's exactly the same effect, but not with faces or spiders, with a meaningless shape, a triangle that was conditioned through Pavlovian conditioning with a loud white noise. And the effect is exactly the same. So when the stimulus, even if it is meaningless, not having an emotional content, actually, this stimulus is better detected by, this is the case of one single patient, when presented to the left. So yeah, a meaningless shape with emotional meaning. And this goes along with increased response in visual cortex for both seen and unseen stimuli, and also with amygdala response. But this is just one example among many. So the idea is that emotion, and in this case, the amygdala, may boost stimulus awareness, alleviating neglect symptoms. But does it actually boost the stimulus awareness also in healthy in general? We have seen that it is involved in the increased sensory response, which might be a requirement for more awareness. And here there is some data. Of course, this is a still ongoing work, but we have seen that amygdala activity occurring before a stimulus in a CFS task may be associated with stimulus detection. So in fact, the more, with undetected stimuli, there was an increase in activity, and this was somehow related to hit rate for faces in general. So there is some link. We still need to see if it's there is a causality effect. We need to test visual contacts. So finally, long-lasting effects. There might be also long-lasting effects on how we process, how we perceive the stimulation when it is emotional. And here I'm just going to present briefly 2 examples from people in my lab in Geneva. So one is changes, so emotion effects on might change subjective perception of stimuli that have been presented later. So, So when people visualize some movies with an emotional content, for example, a negative movie specifically, and then they are presented with ambiguous faces that are morphed, it seems like for a few minutes later, there is a shift in their perception of these ambiguous faces. So they tend to increase their propensity to classify ambiguous faces as being fearful. So there might be some change in the subjective perception. And finally, other long-lasting effects, there might be emotion changes in cortical representation of the stimulus. So this is a complicated paradigm, but I will give just a brief. So when a face is conditioned through aversive conditioning, and then it is presented together with the same identity of the face, but with a different view, actually, basically what we can say is that emotional processing, so of this conditioned face, activates the representation of the stimulus across different views. So the cortex, the visual cortex and the amygdala are responding are somehow creating a template that generalizes this conditioned face, and it goes across different views. So to your questions, so I think I can more or less respond to some of your questions. Appraisal influences attention, which in turn influences perception. Well, my response would also be yes. Valence remains outside perception. I'm not totally sure. There is only what we may call standard perception in an affectively charged environment. I would say no, because valence value may be attributed to virtually all perceptual levels, even prior to consciousness, and may last long. And sensory perception is not only the input itself, but how it is processed. Online state signals or reentrant loops, not necessarily specific to value, shape and bias perception. And finally, is affective salience similar to other types of salience? Well, I would say yes and no, because affective salience is only effective as long as it is experienced consciously or unconsciously by the individual as having a potential impact on their well-being, personal goals, survival, but it may be a continuum, I may say, and shaped by individual experience, learning, and also innate biases, for example, or online states or traits, anxiety, for example. So I think that's all. Thank you very much.
lot of data, very interesting. We have time for questions. Well,
So I'm interested in the phenomenon you noted that seeing a salient, an emotional face biases your perception of a morph,
Yeah.
a neutral morph. So there's a well-known perceptual adaptation phenomena that looks like that. But you said that this was a long-lasting effect,
Yeah,
which would be incompatible with adaptation, which is very brief.
well, I have to say, I did not do this study myself, so I don't know all the details, but that's something that Patrick asked me to present. I have to say that they tested this for several minutes, 2 minutes after presenting so they tested this for a few minutes, at least 2 minutes, and they still saw this effect. So I don't know if this is long lasting or can be considered.
Oh, that's a long time for an
Yeah.
adaptation effect. It's a little hard to know what the explanation
Yeah.
would be.
It's not on.
No, the left. No, the middle.
Here, sorry. So actually, to the adaptation question, the lasting effect of adaptation depends on how much the adaptation, for how long the adaptation took place. So if you adapt for 5 minutes, it lasts 5 minutes. If you adapt for 1 hour, it lasts 1 hour. So I don't know the details of the study, but what is surprising is that they actually go in line with what you saw, because adaptation would predict the opposite. So I don't think it's about adaptation. It may be more like priming. Adaptation would say that you would see the opposite.
Yeah. But isn't that what you showed?
No,
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So yes, question on the back.
Very nice talk. Thank you. You mentioned that the relation between amygdala and emotional awareness is a debated topic. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what exactly amygdala contributes or not contributes to emotional awareness. Does it play any role, or is it really survival behavior and modulating other circuits that contributes to awareness?
I'm not sure I understood the question, but so the big debate is whether the amygdala actually can detect, so whether awareness is necessary for the amygdala to respond to an emotional or a salient stimulus. And there is a lot of evidence supporting that it does, that it can be, it responds if you, under masking paradigms, attentional blink paradigms, and there is a number of conditions in which this has been tested and showing amygdala response, sometimes correlated with response in sensory cortices and so on. But there is also, we have to say, other evidence showing that in certain manipulations, it doesn't work. And maybe, in fact, the main problem may be how we actually mask or how we actually manipulate awareness in all of these tasks. But it seems like, I would say from what we have seen that the amygdala can respond before awareness, and that would be
right. So yeah, so I think, sorry, can I ask a follow-up question? I don't think my question was clear.
I mean, we have a general discussion at the end, so maybe you can come back.
or you want later.
I guess I'm so like amygdala responding in unconscious trials doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't contribute to emotional awareness. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, do you agree with, for example, Joe Ledoux's idea that amygdala is only survival behavior and doesn't contribute to awareness at all?
That could be another. So, but yeah, of course, that could be another. It is part of the debate too. So, but the idea is that as long as the amygdala is responding sufficiently to the stimulus, there should be some ignition. That is, then it would send projections to the sensory cortices and then affect awareness. But of course, it could be perfectly that the amygdala is not responding sufficiently, and then it does not contribute to awareness. But the relationship between amygdala and awareness or sensory response seems to be, so once it has responded sufficiently, the idea is that it would really contribute to awareness. I don't know if it's a very difficult question.
We'll come back to it if we
Yeah.
want, if we have the time at the last the final discussion. I'm sorry, you have to keep your questions. So thanks a lot, Judy.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Frederick for making this thing happen. Thank you very much. And let's jump straight to your talk.
If I
because
can
you're-
find it.
Okay.
Okay. Someone help
Remember
me.
to share the screen so that
Yeah, I mean, I'm still sharing the screen. I'm just losing I have just lost my talk. Here. Here it is. So
I think you have to stop it, don't share this one.
stop share, but I mean, you don't want to stop share.
It was only sharing her PowerPoint, not the whole screen.
Okay. So, up. So let's go back. to the screen. Thank you.
Do you want us to tell you?
Yes, please. Yeah. Okay. So that should be it. Okay, so what I'm going to present is what I mentioned earlier as a survivalist account. And roughly it's my new project, trying to understand whether we see the world differently when we are in danger. You might think that there has been a bit of context recently this last few years about this question. And I have to say from the beginning that I don't have yet the reply. So it's more like work in progress that I'm going to present. So, but let me start with Heini Heidegger, who was a Swiss biologist who described his view of animal behavior both in freedom and captivity. And he says this kind of pessimistic view, I would say, by far the chief preoccupation of wild animals at liberty is finding safety. The beyond and end all of its existence is flight. Hunger and love occupy only a secondary place, since the satisfaction of both physical and sexual wants can be postponed, while flight from the approach of a dangerous enemy cannot. In freedom, an animal subordinates everything to flight. That is the prime duty of an individual for its own preservation and for that of the race. With such an emphasis on flight behavior, on safety, you can imagine that the brain evolved in a specific way to actually detect danger. But when we look at the literature about danger, most of the time it's just in affective neuroscience that you can actually find things about danger perception. And fear is typically conceived as a primary mechanism and sometimes only mechanism specifically tuned to danger. And I want to question this claim. And actually, it might be evolutionary adaptive to dissociate danger awareness or danger detection on the one hand and fear on the other hand. Why is that the case? Well, the fact is that we work according to a precautionary principle, something like a better safe than sorry, such that we tend to overestimate danger. So we have, it has been found that we have this bias to automatically assume danger in ambiguous situations. But on the other hand, one is afraid, one invests a lot of cognitive energy into self-defense. And this can be at the cost of other types of the behaviors that are also important for survival, no matter what Heidegger say. So for instance, if you this animal, if you are afraid that you might stop drinking, but you also need to drink, and given that you overestimate, so you have false positive, it might not be that good to always associate fear and danger detection. Hence, the creature is more likely to survive if it is not systematically afraid of everything that it evaluates as dangerous. And interestingly, there has been empirical cases of dissociation between danger detection and fear. And in a way, Judith already mentioned the case of neglect, but it has been repeatedly argued by Franz and Cholet-Doux that one can process danger independently of fear. Just to give you two examples, in a healthy participant, the subliminal presentation of threat can activate the amygdala and elicit physiological responses without the participant reporting any subjective feeling of fear. But you have also what is known as affective blindsight. So I'm assuming that you are all familiar with blindsight patients who have a lesion in V1 and report no visual awareness, where they are still able to discriminate between threatening and non-threatening stimuli and displays the relevant bodily responses. So you might say, okay, there is something going on here, and it's not just fear, and we have to move beyond the idea that it's all about fear. And so more or less my interest is this classic cartoon, and we are all familiar with. You remember the coyote is always chasing the roadrunner, and there is always a point where chasing the roadrunner, he realizes suddenly that he's up in the sky facing the void. And what I'm really interested in is what's going on in his mind at this time. So I've watched too many cartoons when I was a kid. So you could say at the affective level where he panicked, maybe. You could say at the motor level, he's ready to run back to the cliff. At the attentional level, most probably the void and everything has become very salient to him. But my question is, what's going on at the perceptual level? Does the coyote suddenly see the world differently? And more specifically here for this talk, does it see it as being dangerous? So that's my question today. And one might immediately reply, no, the coyote just sees the void, the clouds, the sky, whatever. But on the basis of this visual experience, he then generate a post-perceptual belief that the situation is dangerous. So it's only at this stage that you get the notion of danger. The problem with this kind of reply is that it doesn't seem to be fully compatible with what we have seen just before. And that's the idea that there is something, there is a kind of emergency attached to danger. It's not like any property. It's not like, okay, the green color here, there is no emergency processing it. Danger, that's something that we do need to process very quickly in order to react. And it's confirmed by this idea that the amygdala and the can be activated very early as 100 milliseconds. So you might say, okay, we want something quick, but yet it doesn't need to be perception. We could imagine that what the coyote has is a kind of intuition based on a kind of quick and dirty assessment of the situation. I mean, like yesterday we had Daniel Kahneman with us, and we all familiar with the system 1, system 2 ID, and you could say, well, there is a system 1 that is specifically tuned to danger, that will be quick, and that's all we need, and we don't need perception. And of course, it's not always easy to take apart this kind of intuition and perception, given that they have many things in common. But since there is a big difference, intuitions are supposed to be conceptual. And you might wonder whether we really want to have this grasp of danger only at the conceptual level. We want to have some creature, I don't know for the conceptual repertoire of the coyote, but we have some creature at least that do not have the concept of danger, but they can still represent somehow the situation as dangerous. So maybe there is something about non-conceptual danger. You might say, okay, you don't want the concepts, that's fine, but then it might be just about action. Maybe you just have, we've seen the amygdala, we can be connected also with the motor system by a direct path, and we don't need to go through perception then to action. So it could be just a direct path from one to the other. And that's what is going on with the coyote. But this will be a kind of naive view of escape behavior. People always tend to think that it's just like escape, run away, and it's a kind of stimulus response reaction. But escape behavior are a lot more complex. And here I will just refer to experts, people that are a lot more expert than I, like this paper by Dominic Evans and collaborators, who describe that there is a richness to escape behavior. They say escape behavior are not only simple stimulus reaction. Successful and adaptive escape behavior relies on integrating information from sensory system, store knowledge in internal states. And just to take the example of this little creature, in order to know to escape, it has to look around, look for shelters, look at the orientation on the trajectory of the predator, which shelter will be the best. And for that, it needs to process the visual scene. So it's not just, it has to be all integrated into a visual scene. So you could say that perception is needed to plan the right response. So maybe at the end, there is something like danger perception. Maybe the coyote sees the situation as dangerous. And actually, some people might think that this is absolutely not controversial, because that's what Gibson has been defending for more than 50 years. Because that's the idea that when we talk about affordance, people always say that, okay, so drink, the glass is graspable, and that's a typical example. But actually, affordances are a lot stronger, the intuition of affordances, when it comes to negative affordance. That's what he says. The medium substances, surfaces, objects, places, and other animals have affordances for a given animal. They offer benefit or injury, life or death. This is why they need to be perceived. So danger perception is just a kind of affordance perception. But of course, as we also all know, this notion of affordance and perception of affordance is quite controversial. And it's not because he says this is why they need to be perceived well. So there's something missing here in the argument. So you might wonder, okay, do we really visually experience affordances and specifically danger? And that's where we get into the mess of the border between perception and cognition. Clearly, I mean, it took Ned more than 500 pages to solve the issues. I won't be able to do it in the next few minutes. So what I'm going to do is my best in the time that I have now. But just to recap where I stand right now, I have argued that one cannot explain away danger perception. We cannot just reduce that to some kind of belief or intuition or sensory motor loop. There seems to be something that is perceptual. But I haven't given you any positive evidence that it does exist. So what could be the next step? Well, there are two challenges that I have to face. The first is empirical. What kind of evidence could prove the point that it is really perceptual? And the other one is conceptual. Can a property such as the dangerous really be part of a visual content? So let me start with the empirical challenge. So there has been quite a lot of discussion on this topic recently, and I will just quote here a paper by Alan Humphrey and Charles Firestone, where they just describe several kind of experiments that are really will be the kind of empirical markers of perception. And interestingly, this paper is specifically about the perception of relations. And you could say that danger is typically a relational property. So they don't talk about danger, but it could maybe apply to danger as well. So I'm not going to review all these different paradigms. I just look first at the continuous flash suppression. And I'm very grateful to Judith who already presented it. So the idea is that the time it takes for the stimulus to overcome interocular suppression so that it can be reported by an observer provide a measure of access to awareness. And there was a study that was done by Gaillet a few years ago. What they did is that they used a famous gamma patch that we love so much, but they associated them with electric shocks. So it was not about facial expression, so that these stimuli became aversive. And what they found is that they gain faster access to awareness. And interestingly, in a follow-up study, they control for manipulating top-down attention, asking the subject to pay specific attention either to the location or to the color, and they did not find the same effect. So there was something that seemed to be quite specific here to affective silence. So that's the first paradigm. Another one that is quite interesting, and it's adaptation. I mean, just to quote Ned, he said in his book that it could be one of the main scientific indicators of what is perceptual and what cognitive. And he explained it, saying that the evolutionary purpose of perception is acquiring information about what is happening here and now. Call that news. Any feature of the visual system that produces a constant effect has to be filtered out in order to focus on news. And that's why we have adaptation. And what is adaptation? Is just the habituation of neural responses after exposure to a certain stimulus, resulting in inhibition of behavioral response towards this attribute. And it has been shown, and one classic example is motion adaptation, but it has been shown also for causal relations and for facial expression. So typically for face, the exposition to a sad face for an extensive duration will modify the perception of the subsequently presenting neutral face as reflecting happiness. Now, I want to focus to one specific study on facial expression by Su and Su, not sure I pronounce it well, where what is interesting is not showing that, okay, we can have adaptation for facial expression, but comparing different kinds of facial expression and how they might work slightly differently. So it was anger, angry face, or happy face. And what they found, and they did it different duration of exposition, and what they found is that they got the adaptation effect very early on. So only when after 17 milliseconds of presentation suffice for the adaptation. So you might say, well, that's still, maybe that we can take another argument that this is really perceptual. However, this kind of paradigm leave me kind of puzzled. I'm a philosopher, I'm not a psychologist. And if we go back to Ned's theory, I mean, the whole idea of adaptation is like, okay, we focus on news, but in the case of a threat, I mean, can it be that a threat is just all news so quickly? Actually, I would expect the exact opposite effect. Then we do not adapt to threat because they are still important. So we do not stop processing them. So it seems to be quite counterproductive that we have this kind of adaptation effect. Furthermore, I mean, I would highly recommend one of the paper by Ian Phillips here with Charles Firestone discussing about this notion of adaptation and as a marker of perception. But in this context of this specific study, I think that there is also the problem that you don't know what the adaptation is for given the way it is designed. Because is it just for low-level features? Unfortunately, they are not like Marisa, they didn't control for that, like reversing the face, it would have been nice, but it didn't do that. So you could say, okay, it might be just anger, or is it threat, something really about danger? There is no control for that. And if you want to know what would be my ideal study, I'm not sure it is feasible, is that there will be adaptation with different kind of stimuli that have all in common the fact that they are threatening. And the fact is there are many things that can look threatening. So it could be, okay, an angry face, but it could be the knife, it could be the snake. And if you could find an adaptation presenting all that, then I might be convinced that it is really adaptation that clearly indicates something that is specific to threat. But the fact is there is no sensory look to danger, and because it looks like too many things. And that brings me to my philosophical question, conceptual question. I mean, like so far, I haven't defined danger, and I have a very naive view of danger here. Kind of mind-independent property, what can potentially harm a given individual at times. This is actually quite insufficient because when you really push further, it's not sufficient. But still, let's take this one. And even with this one, is it really something that you can visually experience, visually represent? And Susanna Siegel had for herself the same kind of objection when she was arguing that we could perceive causal relationship. And she imagined an opponent saying like, causation is a kind of counterfactual dependence or a kind of energy transfer or a kind of lawful necessitation. None of these things can be represented in visual experience. That's not a plausible candidate for visual content. And she buys a bet. She says, yes, that's true. But it's not a problem. That's more or less her solution. She said, well, we can still represent causation in visual experience without representing its distinctive feature. Then, of course, it's like, okay. So, and she has argument why she wants to define that, and I'm not going into that. But there is a big question. We are left with a big question. Okay, if we are not representing this kind of property, then what do we really represent? And for causality, she talked about spatial temporal contiguity. But what could it be for danger? It's still not clear. So as you see, it's not like it's really work in progress. I've left you with the motivation to defend danger perception, but not yet all the answer. I think there are still quite a lot of challenges if you really want to account for it. But what I really want to highlight is that, okay, there have been many discussions of perception of affordances, causality, relation, but I don't know why danger has been neglected, why it might seem like if we believe Heidegger, that it should be the prime duty to perceive danger for an organism. And I think that more work should be done on the topic. And especially because if at the end we can show that we could have something like perceptual content pertaining to danger, then it would mean that perceptual experiences can be evaluative, at least on that respect. But to say that something can be evaluative, can have evaluative content, is not yet to say that perception, the perceptual experience itself, is affectively charged. And I think there is another step to go from the evaluative content to the affective charge of a visual experience. But I think at least that is the beginning. Thank you. I like my view.
So thank you for a great talk and for a wonderful symposium. So I have quite a general question in terms of what you think the embodied nature of emotion is. So as was discussed in one of the questions, there's been a lot of focus on negative emotion. So as again discussed earlier this morning, Mark Solms and also Jaak Panskep's proposal that the basis of conscious experience is actually affect. And thinking about affect more generally, I know, how do we define affect? Like, what is emotion is still a big question. But thinking about emotion as an embodied process, and this is easier to see in the interoception literature, but in thinking about, and I think you mentioned it really beautifully, in thinking about negative emotion and fear and anger, that, you know, it elicits really strong physiological responses. And it's unsurprising that the more embodied your emotional response, the larger the effect on perception. So there's a long way to ask. So would you agree, or what are your thoughts around the embodied aspect of emotional experience?
So before working on that topic, I was working on embodiment and actually often trying to fight against the notion of embodied cognition and embodied emotion. And I was not really defending this kind of view. And I think that for emotion, I'm not going to deny that there is this bodily coloring of all our emotions. Whether this is how central it is to emotion, that's still a question that needs to be solved. But in a way, it will not, I mean, like, it will be interesting to look if indeed, like, there are now lots of effect of interoception and perception, and Catherine Talon-Baudry has beautiful work on the topic. But that's not the same as to say that it is really the affect. I mean, like, what she has is gastric rhythm that can influence perception. I'm not sure that, okay, I'm starving right now, that it has so much to do with affect in the sense that I've been describing here. So I think that we have to be careful when we want, I mean, it's already a complete picture. If you want to add to that the bodily dimension, we have first to make sure that it does play an explanatory role in the influence of perception. And for that, I will need the data that really shows that it's related to that, although just not independently that the body might influence perception. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, just a very little comment about that. I mean, it is known, maybe there is not so much evidence, but it is quite known that the physiological response may, in fact, impact emotional processing. I remember there's these classic studies where I don't know if someone can help me on that, but there is this studies where if you increase CO2 in the air that you're breathing, you can actually induce panic attacks. This is a really classic, I don't know, I mean, if that has a direct impact on the sensory response and all that is implicated in the emotional response. But actually, I mean, there is a lot of evidence showing this mutual impact, right? And usually the increased sensory response and the increased, for instance, amygdala response correlates with the physiological response. So
So thank you for your talk. So a little bit wrapping my head around it, but while I was hearing it, I was maybe thinking of the starter response, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Like if you hear this sudden blast, this noise, and then you jump, and you blink your eyes also, which defensive reflex is really well mapped. And it takes place within 20 milliseconds. So it is really like it just goes right to the brainstem. It doesn't go to a cortical region. It can be modulated by being afraid, so it can be potentiated, but it's otherwise it's really a reflex, defensive reflex. How does that have does that not maybe challenge a little bit your ideas?
When I was trying to say, when I say it could be just, kind of sensory motor reaction, then I was thinking of these kind of cases. And I just think that, yes, we do have these very basic defensive reflexes that can completely bypass perception. And there is this low-level subcortical route that exists that has been documented. But it's not only about that. So that's the thing. So yeah, what good does it? I mean, like the blink reflex is very nice, but it's not saving your life most of the time. So you need to have more sophisticated behavior. And I think that when it gets to something, and even the kind of typical, the 3F, freeze, flight, or Yes, right. As you can see, I'm not too aggressive person. Then that leads more sophisticated things. And even if you look at the freeze response, it's quite interesting to see that there is a lot of modulation of perception during the freeze response. And that's actually also something that is quite interesting to study. During the freeze response, you see modulation of early sensory processing.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Hila Jacobson from the Hebrew University, and she will be presenting the most philosophical talk of the series, just by a beautiful conclusion for all we have been arguing, arguing how perceptual experience can be literally affectively charged, while for now we were kind of cautious on the topic, but she is going all the way. So thank you, Hila.
Hi, thanks. Okay, so the orthodox philosophical conception of perception contrasts cold, motivationally inert standard perception with hot, motivationally potent emotion and affect. According to it, the phenomenal characters of perceptual experiences, for example, the way the beer looks or tastes, consist in or exhausted by their affect-filled sensory aspects, such as amber color, bitterness, etc. According to a recent view, which I'll call the valence conception, perceptual experiences have another fundamental phenomenal aspect over and above their sensory aspects. So perceptions are intrinsically valence. Very roughly, their phenomenal character is inherently pleasant or unpleasant. They feel good or bad to some degree. The beer tastes not only bitter, it also tastes delicious. In general, the sensible world is a hot world involving both engaging and repellent aspects. Now, it's possible to hold this view, but restrict it to some perceptual experiences. I think, as Frederic said, that similar things apply to experiences within and across sense modalities, from overtly unpleasant pains, that's the easiest case, to apparently neutral visual experiences of everyday objects. So teacups, if you want to really important.
Can you share your screen?
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Sorry. So my view is really not only inflationary, it has a very wide scope. Okay. Well, actually, because we mean different things by inflationary. Okay. Now, of course, both conceptions can accommodate the obvious fact that perceptual episodes, like the one of looking at this horrendous wound, are often closely associated with affect or valence, but they're supposed to be radically different. So very roughly, the orthodox view offers what we may call a perception and valence interpretation. Looking at the wound may result in disgust, fear, or some more primitive affective aversion. The perceptual experience is a cognitive base of a self-standing emotion, or is occurring with an early process yet distinct affective element. So here, the valence is extrinsic to the perception. The valence conception, in contrast, suggests a perception is valenced interpretation. The wound looks not only reddish, oval-shaped, and woundish, perhaps. It also looks bad or repellent. So we have here really a single unitary perceptual state. The valence is intrinsic to the perception. You may rightly complain that the notions such as internal and external or distinct element versus single unitary state are in dire need of elucidation. I totally agree. So that's to a large extent what I'll try to do on this point. Okay, so in previous work, I focused on whether perception is valence, try to motivate this idea, and if so, how should we account for it? For example, is the valence aspect representational or attitudinal? Is it truth apt or satisfaction apt? But I came to think that there was something premature about jumping straight to these issues because I don't have yet a firm grip on what valence perception is. So that's what I want to focus on today, present some initial thoughts about what can valence perception be, or more accurately, because I want to argue that perception is valence, on what it could be. How is the notion of intrinsically valence perception, which I'll call IVP, to be understood? If perception is valence, what should be the relations between valenced aspects and sensory aspects? And given various plausible constraints, is the notion of IVP even coherent? I tend to think that it faces serious theoretical difficulties. Somebody asked me before, why is it that nobody took that seriously, this idea? So I think there are reasons to, from a philosophical perspective, to be very suspicious about it. Okay, so I'll try to unpack the notion of IVP by identifying various constraints and desiderata that IVP should meet, and I'll then offer a more specific determination dimension model of the relations between sensory and valenced aspects. Okay, so first, at the most general level, IVP should answer to the principle I call individuation. Valenced aspects, as aspects that are intrinsic to the phenomenal character of particular perceptual experiences, are essential to the individuation of these experiences, qua perceptual experiences. I haven't said nothing yet. This merely expresses our initial desideratum. It leaves us with various challenges. In what sense can valence be essential to the individuation of particular perceptual experiences? Relatedly, what precisely is the difference between the perceptual and valence and the perception is valence interpretations? And moreover, is there a substantive question here? Is there a substantive question as to whether the visual case, for example, involves a single visual experience or properly visual experience plus a non-visual affective component? Isn't this just a matter of stipulation? The next principle expresses a requirement. Valenced aspects are modality and sensorially specific. Valences are strongly bound with sensory aspects of experiences of given sense modalities, with sensory appearances, in that they characterize or qualify how things look, taste, nociceptively feel, etc. So the wound looks bad. And again, I'm noting two aspects here. First, the wound looks rather than tastes or generically feels bad, and it is the wound that looks bad. At the same time, I think it's possible that valenced aspects are not sensory aspects. Strictly speaking, valence aspects are not looks, tastes, nociceptive feels, etc. Neither low level nor high level one. And I really like your saying, Frederick saying here, valence does not look like anything, or it looks like too many things. So we have another challenge here. How can unpleasantness characterize the way the wound looks without being itself a look? More generally, how can valence characterize the sensory appearance of an object or property without being itself a sensory appearance? So we reach principle 3, which for me is really central, intrinsicality as phenomenal uniqueness. An experience with sensory aspect S1 has its valence aspect at V1 intrinsically if V1 cannot be taken in isolation from S1 while maintaining its phenomenal identity. V1 is phenomenally non-factorable from S1, so that when V1 is bound with S1, the way it's like to experience V1 is phenomenally unique. So I take this to express a defining feature of IVP. Let's start with the example of pain. Sensorially different pains, for example, a diffused headache and a paper cut, are not painful in the same way. They do not share a phenomenally distinct valence component, a phenomenal common aspect, if you will. Rather, each of them is painful in its own distinctive way. Each painful aspect is phenomenally unique. This is more central for us. Here's another illustration. Think first of a sensory binding, standard sensory binding. So look at the blue shapes. Sensory qualities such as colors and shapes exhibit what I call componential binding. I'm talking about what's going on phenomenally. As far as their color is concerned, the circle and the rectangle look exactly the same. They share a distinct phenomenal component. Now think of a sensory valence binding. So compare a spoiled wine experience and a sensorially different and pleasant gustatory experience, for example, spoiled milk, guava, eggplant, whatever. These experiences feel bad. More specifically, they taste bad, yet they do not taste bad in the same way. They do not share a distinct valence phenomenal component. When tasting bad is taken in conjunction with different sensory aspects, the result is phenomenally unique. Each of the substances tastes bad in its own distinctive way. What can be said in support of intrinsicality? First, I think it's supported by introspection and phenomenological observation, and relatedly, it cashes out the intuitive notion that the two aspects are phenomenally fused together, like the taste, the delicious taste. But more importantly, intrinsicality answers desiderata 1 and 2 and resolves the challenges. So individuation, valence aspects are non-stipulatively crucial to the individuation of particular perceptual experiences. The tokening of perceptual phenomenal types necessitates both the tokening of particular sensory aspects and the tokening of particular valence aspects. No stipulation. Next, intrinsicality clearly distinguishes between the valence perception and the perception and valence interpretations. The latter doesn't answer to it. Specificity, valence aspects are inextricably linked to specific sensory aspects in particular sense modalities. The unpleasantness characterizes the wound visual experience because it is phenomenally unique to experiences with the wound's visual sensory aspect. And in this way, valence can characterize how the wound looks without being how they look without being themselves looks. That was the last challenge so far. And I'll say a little bit more about this one later. Lastly, an experiment we just ran and analyzed provides some empirical support for intrinsicality, I think. This is not even work in progress, it's only the beginning, work in collaboration with Usher, Algom, and Ongil. We show that sensory and valence aspects are susceptible to garner interferences. And I can't say a lot about this, maybe in the Q&A, but I think that this shows that they're integral dimensions and that this shows that gives some support for intrinsicality. Okay. So intrinsicality seems to capture what's required for IVP, but there's another constraint on IVP, valence variance, VV, as I call it. Experiences that share their sensory aspects can have different intrinsic valence aspects. And this is true both intersubjectively and intrasubjectively. For some, eggplants are tasty, and for others, they're unpalatable. I used to dislike the taste of eggplants. Now I find it delicious. And valence variance is very well supported empirically. So I think that VV presents us with another challenge. Namely, there seems to be tension between this principle on the one hand and individuation and intrinsicality on the other hand. How can valences be essential and intrinsic to the individuation of perceptual experiences with specific sensory aspects if they can vary independently of those aspects? It might be thought that if the sensory aspect does not determine the valence aspect, then the relation is contingent and the valence aspect is external to the perception. It may seem that if experiences with a sensory aspect S1 can be token both with and without some valence aspect V1, then S1 and V1, just like redness and squareness, are decomposable into phenomenally distinct components, which I wanted to avoid. So for each Sn and Vn, we should show that the following can both be true. Vv, Sn can be taken in isolation from Vn, and intrinsicality, Vn cannot be taken in isolation from Sn while maintaining its phenomenal identity. So an appropriate model for IVP should take valences and sensory aspects to be logically independent orthogonal features, yet such that the phenomenal character of a given experience is a non-componential function of both features. And this brings me to the last part of the talk, which is very briefly what I call a determination dimension model, DDM. So DDM is a model of the relations between sensory and valence aspects. It purports to shed further light on individuation and intrinsicality and show them to be compatible with VV. And I think it also helps to further explain how convalences characterize the way things look without being themselves looks. For example, looks. So DDM will allow us to think of the phenomenal characters of experiences as determined according to both their sensory aspects and their valences, where the valences are ways of having those sensory aspects. Here's the central idea. So valence is a determination dimension along which phenomenal characters of experiences with specific sensory aspects or the same sensory profiles vary. And I'm working, of course, with a familiar notion of determination dimension as a dimension along which different determinates of the same determinable vary. Now, the obvious illustration here is color. So DDM explicates the relations between the dimensions of colors, for example, brightness and U plus saturation. We can work with whatever we'd like. So let's just say brightness and H plus S. Brightness is a determination dimension along which shades with fixed H plus S, the determinables, vary. The determinates are shades of this fixed H plus S that differ in their brightness level. So in figure 1, we have such shades, one with fixed U plus saturation profile and gradually increasing levels of brightness. So we get individuation. The level of brightness of a particular determinate shade is clearly essential to the individuation. And specificity, brightness is strongly bound with H plus S. It characterizes how shades with a particular U plus saturation profile look. Next, adding to the diagram other fixed Q plus saturation profiles, obviously along the y-axis, the dark blue and the dark red, which share their level of brightness, look different. So we get brightness intrinsicality. Specific levels of brightness cannot be taken in isolation from a specific H plus S profile while maintaining their looks or phenomenal identity. This is non-componential binding. Phenomenally, H plus S and brightness are not distinct components. They're binding with a specific sensory profile, with a specific profile, H plus S profile, is phenomenally unique. At the same time, and now I return to the x-axis, the medium saturated red can be both very light and very dark. And this delivers a brightness variance. Shades with the same H plus S profile can differ in their brightness. For example, a medium saturated red can be both a very light and looking with fear, Frederick, almost there. A medium saturated red can be both very light and very dark. So brightness intrinsicality is compatible with brightness variance. DDM satisfies the principles and resolves the apparent tensions. Good. Last one, application, very briefly. So I suggest that valence is analogous to brightness. It is a determination dimension along which phenomenal characters of experiences with specific sensory aspects can vary. Valences are thus phenomenal ways of having experiences with specific sensory aspects. As such, valences are, first, essential to the individuation of perceptual experiences with specific sensory aspects. This is individuation. Second, strongly bound with specific looks and characterize or qualify how things with particular sensory aspects look. This is specificity. They're such that they cannot be taken in isolation from specific sensory aspects while maintaining their phenomenal identity. This is non-componential binding. In each sensory valence pairing, they are phenomenally unique. This is intrinsicality. And still, this is fully compatible with the fact that experiences can have phenomenal characters with specific sensory aspects in more than one phenomenal way, specifically in different valenced ways. So this is exactly the case when sensorially identical experiences have different values along the valence dimension. So DDM overcomes the final challenge. There's no tension between intrinsicality and VV. Thank you.
So that's a really interesting talk, but I see a kind of it looks to me like you have two different views that are incompatible. So what, in the case of hue, saturation, and brightness, those are all part of the content of visual experience. We visually represent something as having a certain hue, certain saturation, a certain brightness. Okay, so that's one view, that valence is part of the content of perception. But when you say valences are phenomenal ways of having experiences with specific sensory aspects, that looks more like it's not the part of the content, it is something more like the mode in which the content is held. So which way are you going to go here? You're not, I don't see a clear resolution of which thing you mean.
Okay, so actually, I think that there is symmetry between the two cases, between the color case and our case, because again, let's collapse together a situation in you, okay? This is one thing when you have only when you have the brightness, you have a particular shade, right? So, and by the way, and vice versa, of course. I think that exactly the same thing is true about valence, okay? So we have sensory aspects and valences. Only when you combine the two, you have a particular phenomenal character, a fully determinate. Now, I think that to a large extent, it's not only, first, you're connecting this to, well, I can't answer, I'm realizing that I can't go very long. I don't think that in the color case or in the sensory valence case, you need to have commitments as to whether what's going on is attitudinal or representational. Not at all. I think that both are neutral in this respect. With respect to color, it doesn't make sense, right? In some sense, it is representational. But I don't see the relevance. I think that the model of the logical relations between the aspects is independent of those.
So you prefer not to have a view on whether valence is part of the content of perception?
Of course I have a view, and you know what my view is. And actually, I think that in the long run, this can be an argument, or another argument in favor of my view, that it is a matter of mode and not a matter of content. I can say something.
So, Crunchy?
Yeah, just I'm a bit having some difficulty with the valence versus the color case, because you might think that the reason why those two things, hue and saturation, are baked together in this kind of intrinsic way is because of facts in the world, right? That's what gives us some sort of support to that. But I'm finding it harder to motivate the intrinsic binding that you're seeking to impose on valence and perception, because that intuition isn't driven by anything that's happening in the world, right? And you might think also that, I mean, does your view rule out the possibility of some kind of visual experience with no valence, or creatures who just don't have a kind of valence perception of the world?
Okay, so there are two questions here.
Yeah.
I'll start with the latter. It doesn't rule it out, but in a sense, I think that it allows us to think of cases in which there is no apparent neutrality as cases in which there is a valence, but the value of the valence is zero. Okay, so that's for the second question. Again, as to the first one, I don't see any relation. Again, I think that the view is totally uncommitted as to whether valence is something in the world or not. My personal view is that valence is a highly subjective interrelational feature, okay? But again, now we're talking about the binding in experience, in perception. So it need not be a binding that happens out there.
Okay. So I think that now it is time to open the discussion. So if you want to go back to some of the talks that we had before, or to keep on talking with Hila, just to have a kind of more general discussion. Yes.
Yes, hello. So I would like to thank you all for this amazing session, really thought-provoking, amazing ideas, and very exciting experimental findings. My question would be, so we have talked about how emotion can potentially, like the presence of emotion can enhance or can affect perception. And I was wondering what's all of your opinion on the potential of dampened emotional experience interacting with perception and influencing perceptual processes. So maybe the lack of emotion or dampened emotion, if that makes sense.
Could I repeat it? Yeah. Well, I think in that case, we can think of what I call the neutral phases, right? Because they dampen, I mean, it's the difference that matters, right? So a neutral phase could be boring for some people. Usually we do have an expression. So actually a neutral phase, if anything, is a little bit on the negative side, if you want to think about it that way, right? So what we're doing is trying to see the difference, because again, the magnitudes could be different for any of us, but for everyone, one phase would be more fearful than the other. So in that regard, if you think that you need more contrast after the neutral phase, you would say that that's dampening the perception.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps this could be to everyone, although it was specifically directed to what Hila has just been speaking about, and also with Ned. Are we really talking about an extension of phenomenal experience or qualia to include valence? Basically, in simple terms, you want valence counted as another form of qualia.
Absolutely. But again, it's, in my mind, the only way to do it in a way that would make sense that it's part of perception, since valences are not sensory aspects, is in a sense as a dimension of qualia. But exactly, that's the
yes.
Thank you. Amazing presentation today. As a practicing counselor, my question is for Frederic. You hit on a topic that is just amazing to me, the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system, and also the impact of you had a question in there about how we spend our time. And in modern society, we are spending most of our time in the sympathetic nervous system. And so my question is, if you've done some research or have thought about looking at the enteric nervous system as part of your research, which is when we're not in parasympathetic nervous system, our bile goes down, so we're not be able to process fats as well. And also our ability to process hormones goes down as well. And so just curious about that.
So as I said, it's a new project for me, and I love collaborating with psychologists, but I'm not running experiment myself. As you can see, I can have ideas of how to like an experiment I would like to see, but I think that there's a lot of things to do in clinical population, and there are cases, especially when you can think of course, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, but also of things like depersonalization, when people feel disconnected from their emotion and how much it will affect the way they perceive the world. They are also disconnected from the perception, but is it related? That was the original explanation for depersonalization, that it was a disaffectivation, something like that. So there are like that, lots of things that could be of interest, looking at how we process a threat, and depending on for one reason or another, how it can affect how you perceive. Another example is anorexia nervosa, where we know that they have some kind of perceptual bias when they perceive their body, but it's also an affective disorder, and how much one is linked to the other. And the idea is always kind of a complicated story, but could it be that when they see that the body as monstrous, there is really here a case of affective perception, affective vision. And so, yes, there are lots of questions that are open, but that's the beginning for me. It's not the beginning for the others, so I have a lot more to say. So, yeah.
In characterizing, this is for Hilla, in characterizing valence in sensory episodes as mode, not content, do you intend to, does this thesis extend more broadly to deny the possible existence of affective phenomenology without any sensory content? Some mood states, for example, seem not, arguably do not have sensory. Moods may seem sometimes not to have any sensory content. Of course, maybe Damasio would differ. This may be controversial in many different areas.
Excellent question. So very briefly, what is it today? In the last part, I want to kind of only the determination dimensional model, I think, make me I have to commit that valence always qualifies something. I think that in the case of perceptual experiences, it is sensory aspects. I think that in the case of moods or emotions, it can be content of a non-sensory sort. But I don't think that there can be just valences without anything that they qualify.
What is your reason for thinking that?
It's hard for me to say as a non-representationalist, as a phenomenist who thinks that a phenomenal character is not exhausted by phenomenal character, but I do think that all conscious states have content. So I don't feel pushed to a very problematic corner here. Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much. This is more a question to the whole panel. So you're really been through all of these different effects that emotion have of attention, perception, and all the others. I wanted to know what's your opinion that on like if really affective disorder will have a different perception of the world, a different phenomenology, and link it to that. What's your opinion about the really latest proposition of depression as a disorder of consciousness rather than really just a mood disorder? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what I can say is that there is some evidence, for example, of, that's more or less your question. There is this idea that depressed patients usually process less or have this sense of numbness in the perception of stimuli. And this has been tested empirically. Now I don't remember exactly by whom, but it has been shown that in these patients, perception in general is centrally depressed or centrally decreased. Yeah, but that's all I can say. I mean, of course, it involves lots of complex circuitry, such a disorder, but and I cannot even be sure that the amygdala is actually involved in that, but for sure, this might impact in the senses in general, of course. And in this, the same way as in anxiety, you are more responsive in general. In depression, you are less responsive.
I think if I may add, with Parkinson, for example, when the dopamine level is affected, then obviously there's a flattened response. And there are some data that show that actually people experience the stimuli as less saturated, for example, right? So I think Parkinson, and with Alzheimer, there's actually a lot of effects on visual perceptions. So anything that it is affecting, you know, the neurobiology is going to have consequences in perception.
So, I mean, we are supposed to stop now, but if some of you wants to say and ask more question, like you wanted to ask the question.
Yes, thank you very much for the panel. My question is about attention and perception. As you guys know, there's this work by Luis Pessoa, which is saying that emotions and cognition are part of the same system. And what they're doing is tuning our motivation. And so I'm curious about this word motivation, which didn't come up in the panel. And I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Want to say anything about it? No, I agree that cognition and emotion, I'm believing more and more that they are part of the same potential system, and that of course any structure can take part in this processing and both processing, and that yeah, it's all a continuum, and yeah, might be. I think we're trying to put things in boxes, and it's unnecessary. And the next question was about the motivation. Yeah, well, I mean, if we focus on the amygdala motivation, actually that would refer to any responses to which so reward. So the amygdala has been shown to respond to yeah, reward in general or anything. And this is part of a motivation. So the amygdala would be also part of a motivation system. And motivation, of course, actually has been shown a reward to increase the sensory response to stimuli, for example, to increase sensory processing. If that's your question, or if you want to say something more general, yeah, I mean.
There was a question at the back, and yes.
So I have a question about.
We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Now?
Yes.
There we go. I have a question about danger. Danger as a perceptual experience versus danger as a decision or a judgment that we make cognitively. For example, if I'm not afraid of something that you are, am I hallucinating, or are you hallucinating the danger? That's sort of my question. Danger is a perceptual experience versus danger is a decision.
I mean, it's a noise which does. I mean, I'm thinking, for the first time of my life, I'm from Nickel. I can't hear you. Yeah.
You want?
I know what it's like.
I think at some point you put the microphone too close, so it was distorted. So
I was asking about danger as a perceptual experience versus danger as a decision or a judgment. And for example, if I think something's dangerous, if I see something as dangerous and you don't, am I hallucinating the danger, or am I making a different decision about it?
Like for me, I mean, I'm like, Yeah. And you could say that it is a kind of or not.
It wouldn't be hallucination because there's a stimulus, right? So if there's a stimulus, there can be a misperception. We're just dominated by vision, and then you're going to have all the physiological responses as if you were about to fall, even though you know that you're in a flat surface, right? But I would not call that a hallucination because there's an input that is provoking those responses.
Well, thanks to all of you. Thanks, I would like really to thank Mary Sandy.